Near the end of every year, Time magazine declares their annual Person of the Year. The Person of the Year has been presidents, scientists, lawyers, popes, kings, and astronauts. But I like it when the Person of the Year is not an individual, but is a group of people. I think that's because the group usually stands for a cause that I believe in. For example, the Person of the Year last year were the women in the Me Too movement. In 2005, it was the Good Samaritans. And in 1993, it was peacemakers. One of my favorite Persons of the Year was in 2002. They were the Whistleblowers. Do you remember this? The Whistleblowers. On the cover of the magazine that year were 3 women who risked their careers and even their lives in order to reveal the truth about economic and political corruption in the United States. Cynthia Cooper blew the whistle on the telecommunication company WorldCom as she exposed the company's $3.8 billion in fraud. Next was Colleen Rowley, an FBI agent who documented how the organization mishandled and failed to act on information that could have prevented 9/11 from ever happening. And the third woman Time put on the cover that year was Sharon Watkins, who blew the whistle on Enron's financial fraud. According to the editors of Time, they chose these 3 women because, quote, they were people who did right just by doing their jobs rightly, which means ferociously, with eyes open and with bravery the rest of us always hope we have and may never know if we do. Indeed, it takes bravery to blow the whistle. These women stated that many former friends and colleagues hated them for revealing this corruption. Cynthia Cooper, who blew the whistle on WorldCom, claimed, "There is a price to be paid. There have been times that I could not stop crying because friends abandoned her." To speak the truth about injustice often comes at a price. It may cost you your job, your security, your safety, and your friends, and possibly your family. Unfortunately, we see throughout history that that's the price we may need to pay for making the world a more just and a more loving place. These whistleblowers from 2002 have inspired people to blow the whistle on injustice and corruption ever since. The women and men of the more recent Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Never Again movement, started by teenagers these last few weeks in Parkland, Florida, are just a few of the latest modern examples of people blowing the whistle on corruption. In many instances, underlying those who blow the whistle is a sense of anger. It's an anger that stems from this intuition that something isn't right, that the world isn't supposed to be this way. And I think it's important to point out that blowing the whistle against injustice and corruption is actually a deep spiritual tradition. This anger that's rooted in an intuition that the world isn't supposed to be corrupt goes back thousands of years, and it is at the core of Jewish prophets. Take Moses, for example, the greatest Jewish prophet. As a baby, Moses was placed in a little basket on a river by his mother in order to save him from a decree from Pharaoh that all Hebrew boys should be killed because Pharaoh lived in fear of the Hebrews. Moses floated down that river and was rescued by Pharaoh's daughter, who took Moses as her own son. Moses grew up in the house of Pharaoh. He had privilege. He was adopted as a son of royalty with all the power and prestige of being a prince of Egypt. But as he grew up, he witnessed the corruption and injustice of the Egyptian political, economic, and religious establishment. You see, the Egyptians worshipped the sun god Ra. In fact, many of the pharaohs were thought to be sons of Ra, sons of God. Many pharaohs incorporated Ra's name into their own name. One of the great examples of this is the pharaoh Ramses. Ramses seems to be the pharaoh who enslaved the Hebrew people, and Ramses used his seemingly divine power as the son of God to enslave the Hebrew people and force them to build his pyramids and palaces. According to Egyptian religion at the time, that's what the gods were like. The gods were pure power. The power of being over and against another, the power that leads to injustice. Moses grew up as a grandson of Ramses with all the power and privilege of being a leader in the Egyptian political, economic, and religious systems. But one day, Moses saw an Egyptian taskmaster abusing a Hebrew slave. And in his anger, Moses killed the Egyptian taskmaster, and in that moment, Moses made a decision. Instead of being part of the system of oppression, he blew the whistle on Egypt. But here we also see a problem. In his anger, Moses blew the whistle on Egyptian corruption, but he also broke one of the commandments, "Thou shalt not murder." This reveals one of the great problems with anger. While it can motivate us to do great works of justice, it can also motivate us to do horrific works of violence. Anger needs an outlet, and if we aren't careful, it will be channeled in the wrong direction, against a scapegoat. What is the right direction to channel our anger? I think the Moses story provides a good example, because God did not call Moses to channel his anger against an individual. God called him to channel his anger against systems of oppression and bring his people out of slavery. And so Moses led his people out of slavery, but he did so much more than that. He led humanity in a revolution of our understanding of God. Before Moses, humans always thought that the gods were seen primarily in the powerful, in the pharaohs, in the kings, and in other political and military rulers who hold power of conquest, war, and enslavement of others. But Moses revealed a different God. He revealed the God who stands not with the powerful, but with the victims and the survivors of those rulers and those systems that abuse their power. It's important to have this backstory in mind when we hear the 10 Commandments as they were read today. In the first commandment, God says, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me." So we might ask, what's wrong with having other gods? Other gods look like the gods of Egypt. They lead to religious, political, and economic oppression. This is why what the Bible calls idolatry. The false gods can be faith in a deity like Ra that leads to injustice against another, or they can be false gods. They can be idols that we don't devote ourselves towards, like money or political parties, economic power, patriarchal structures, white supremacy, and guns are all a few modern examples of idolatry. And like our modern-day whistleblowers on the cover of Time magazine, Moses blew the whistle on the oppression and corruption of his day. The ancient example of Moses and the modern example of the whistleblowers reveal that we may need to risk some privilege as we blow the whistle and stand in solidarity with those who are oppressed by violent systems. Jesus did the same thing in his day. He blew the whistle on the abusive power structures in the temple when he saw that those in power worshiped the God of Moses only in name. But in practice, they might as well have been worshiping Ra. According to the Gospel of John, Jesus complained that the temple had been turned into a marketplace. Merchants were selling sheep and cattle and doves for people to purchase in order to make a sacrifice to God. These sacrifices were meant to be an act of confession and also an assurance of God's forgiveness. Now, I think confession and the assurance of God's forgiveness are good things. They are signs of God's eternal love for us, no matter what we do and no matter what we left undone. But notice that those in power made money on God's grace. They sold God's grace for a price. There was an economy of exchange for God's forgiveness. You had to pay to play. The high priest and the money changers acted as the gatekeepers of God's grace. Even worse, the money changers and merchants and high priest were in on the scheme together. Someone who wanted to make a sacrifice had to purchase an animal that was unblemished from a merchant. But often the merchant would cheat by giving them a blemished animal. And so when the worshiper took the animal to the priest would inspect it and it would reject the animal, and the worshiper would be fined for bringing in a blemished animal into the temple. This fine would often put people, especially poor people, in years of economic debt to the temple system. The poor suffered the most from this religious and political exploitation. And this made Jesus angry because he knew that God's grace was free. We never have to experience debt with God, for God gives freely and we can receive freely. So like Moses and our modern day whistleblowers, Jesus blew the whistle on these corrupt practices. He was angry at a systemic injustice, and so he created a whip and cords, and he drove the animals out of the temple. He overturned the tables, and he yelled, "Stop making my Father's house into a marketplace." Now, it seems today that we have a culture that is permeated by anger. Everyone tells us that we should be angry at something or at someone. And I know that there are some things that are worth being angry at. We continue to need whistleblowers who will stand up to corruption. But there's a fine line between anger and Jesus' call to love all people, including those we call our enemies. You see, I'm often a lot more like Moses than I'd like to admit. I have a hard time managing my anger. You'll be glad to know that unlike Moses, I've never murdered anyone in my anger. But in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says that if you are even angry with someone, you've already committed murder in your heart. Those are tough words to live by and tough words to understand. If we can't be angry at another person because it's basically like murder, then what are we supposed to do with our anger? I think Jesus offers a good example. When he saw corruption that angered him, he didn't go after individuals. As one author of the New Testament proclaimed, "Our fight is not with flesh and blood, but with the powers and principalities of the world." Jesus channeled his anger against powers and principalities in hopes to make radical transformation of oppressive systems. And I'm not sure what you may need to hear today. Maybe you are already so consumed with anger that you need to take a little break from it, for your own sake and for your family's sake, maybe. But as I thought about it, I realized that I like to think of myself as a nice person. And as a nice person, I'd rather not be angry at all. Even more, I'm an Oregonian, so I avoid conflict. In other words, I'd rather just be passive-aggressive. Or I'd like to just stuff my anger inside, in part because I'm afraid of my anger. I'm afraid I won't be able to control it because I'm a lot more like Moses than I'd like to admit. But as Jesus shows, there's often a place for anger. When there's injustice in the world, we need people like those women on Time magazine, and like Moses and like Jesus. We need people to blow the whistle and risk their jobs, security, possibly even their friends and families in the name of justice. But as we do that work, we need to be guided by love, with the realization that our struggle is not with flesh and blood, but with the powers and principalities of injustice. So when we experience anger, may we be guided by love. May we channel our anger against the powers and principalities, not against flesh and blood. And may we continue to worship the God who leads us out of oppression and into liberation, grace, and love. Amen. Hi, everyone. This is Adam Erickson, reminding you that no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome at Clackamas United Church of Christ. We are located at 15303 Southeast Webster Road in Milwaukee, Oregon. Our worship service starts at 10:30 on Sundays, except for during the summer months we start at 10 o'clock. If you'd like more information on our church, you can visit our Facebook page or our website at c-ucc.org. You can also reach out to me through email at adam@c-ucc.org. Until next time, grace and peace be with you.